Overnight bus creeper. This is my first post for Reddit, so hopefully it's good enough. If you want to make any suggestions to improve it, please feel free. Anyways, on with my story. So for a few years between 2009 and 2013, I went backpacking through most of Asia by myself. I had a couple of creepy encounters here and there, but the worst one was probably during the overnight bus from Penang, Malaysia to Singapore. I had just started my trip and wasn't aware of the sort of harassment I would occasionally receive from men. I'd overslept and missed my flight, so instead, I had to take an 11-hour bus ride instead. Unfortunately, the date I took it was the ending of school holidays in Malaysia, so most bus companies were completely booked out. I finally found one and paid a ridiculous price for a premium bus ticket. When we finally boarded at around 7 p.m., I discovered that the bus was extremely cramped and dirty, covered with cockroaches running around the seats and along the walls. I turned my thongs flip-flops into a makeshift cockroach swatter and settled in for the long ride. I'd been told we wouldn't get to Singapore until about 7 a.m. The man next to me was Asian, around late 30s to early 40s. He was very interested in me, asking me many questions about where I was going. I told him Singapore, was I alone, where I would be staying, how old I was, did I have a boyfriend. I made awkward but polite small talk with him, making up a fictional boyfriend. Eventually, it got late, and we both tried to get some sleep. Fear of the cockroaches kept me awake though, so I spent an hour or so just lying there with my eyes closed, attempting sleep, when I felt a hand brush against my left thigh. I ignored it, since maybe it was an accident. Maybe his hand had just slipped from the armrest. I felt it again, squeezing my leg. Then, the hand moved to my right thigh. Not an accident. I opened my eyes and he quickly drew his hand back. I asked him to please stop and rolled over in my seat to try and sleep again. This time, after a few minutes, I felt his hand rub my back and grasp my ass. I shifted away further and he stopped. He left me alone for a while and I thought it was fine, up until I felt him shift closer to me and realized he was sniffing my neck and making moaning sounds. I rolled over and told him to cut it out. He left me alone for the rest of the trip. Dodged a bullet, I thought. I managed to get a tiny bit of sleep, then awoke at 6:30 a.m. when the bus stopped. The man shook my shoulder and told me, "Come on, get out, it's Singapore." The time seemed right, so groggy, I hopped off the bus and went up to the bus conductor to get my luggage. Luckily for me, he remembered I was traveling to Singapore, as he told me to get back on the bus. This was still Malaysia. We hadn't crossed the border yet. Singapore was the next stop. I turned around to see the man staring at me from a large group of men clustering around the bus, and very quickly boarded the bus again. As we drove away, I wondered if he'd done that deliberately. Then I remember that I had told him Singapore was my destination the night before, and he knew this was not Singapore. Not that I would have gone anywhere with him, but still, creepy that he tried. Let us help you take a load off. Back in 2011, I was 22 and was in my clubbing phase. One Saturday night in the spring, I had gone downtown to Toronto to go with my girlfriends and packed an overnight bag to stay over, since the bus ride home is 45 minutes long and stops running at 1 a.m. We went clubbing, came home, and hung out and drank wine until the morning. At 5:30 a.m., I had to catch a cab to the bus station because I had to work at 7 a.m. Despite the fact that I was wearing sweatpants and a sweater, my hair and makeup still looked nice, as I hadn't taken it off from clubbing. I arrived at the bus station and got a ticket, and saw my bus would arrive in about 20 minutes, so I decided to wait out on the platform. At 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning, there was not a lot of people on the bus station, so it was just me, an older man, and a group of 5 guys who looked to be a little bit older than me. They were talking about their night out clubbing when I walked into sight and they went quiet. They talked amongst themselves for about 2 minutes in hushed voices, and I stood at the bus stop minding my own business. I messaged the guy I was interested in, now my fiance, telling him I was waiting for the bus and how I was dreading work. He said he would come get me, but it would be a 25-minute drive to come to where I was, and a 25-minute drive back to our town. I told him not to worry about it since the bus was leaving in only 15 minutes now. When I looked up from my phone, I noticed a group of guys were very close to me, but had now moved behind me instead of a few feet to my left, where they had been before. They started talking to me, asking me why my bag that I was carrying was so big. I just ignored them, but found myself growing agitated, since they started to form some sort of circle around me. There was nobody around to see what was happening, so I immediately felt my adrenaline start pumping. One guy asked where I was headed, and if I wanted to sit on his lap on the bus. I rolled my eyes and started to move away. He said, "Okay, you can sit on all our laps on the bus, is that fair?" I gave him a dirty look and said, "It's too early for this bullshit, cut it out." This seemed to rile him up, and they started to follow me down the platform. Another one of the guys said, "At least let us take a look at that big bag. Take this big load, girl." And another said, "Get down and take all of our loads." And they all started laughing. I started realizing what they were really talking about, and I started to feel panicked. I was searching for one of those buttons you could press in case of emergency or danger on the bus platform. I then saw in the distance the bus had to take the round to corner and stop at the far end of the platform. I glanced at my phone and noticed it was probably gonna wait there until it was scheduled to leave in 7 minutes. The guys caught up to me, and one of the guys wrapped his arms around me and forcefully hugged me from behind. I pulled away and he slapped my butt and grabbed it and said, "We just want a piece of that ass." I finally told him to fuck off and that I'll be reporting this incident to the bus company and the cops. This didn't seem to faze them, and I took off towards the bus. The bus driver was reading the paper when I got to the bus and knocked on the door. He opened it and I said, "This is the bus I have to take. Would it be okay for me to get on now? Those guys on the platform have been harassing me." The bus driver looked worried and let me on and told me to sit in the very front. When it came time to pull up to the platform, the only people that were getting on were of course the 5 guys. My heart sank, and they all stayed close to the front and told me they didn't understand why I didn't find them attractive. The bus driver told them to move away and leave me alone. I messaged my coworker and asked him if he could please come meet me at my bus stop close to my work, just in case they would follow me off, and he said he would meet me there in his car. After this whole ordeal, I had so wished I had taken the ride from my crush. To this day, he never lets me take public transportation alone. The man with the long fingernails. I graduated high school in 2007, and despite my middle-class family existing in a relatively comfortable financial situation, they were unwilling to help pay for college. Needless to say, I was crushed as I said goodbye to most of my friends as they embarked onto the next step of their lives. By September, I found a pretty good job at an organic grocery store and had more or less come to peace that my path was careening down a different direction as my peers from school. Now, while my parents did not really place much emphasis on higher education, I had spent much of my youth being regaled by tales from my mother of her extensive travels across the country. As she likes to put it, I definitely inherited her wanderlust and passion for seeing new places. By the end of the month, I began feeling mildly depressed and lonely. I was stuck in our small town alone. I spent a lot of time working, but also Skyping with my high school friends. I had a friend that I met on Neopets around 2002. I'm dating myself, I know, who lived in Toledo, OH. And while we had met online, we had visited each other and hung out multiple times. She's totally awesome, and we are still friends. Well, she and I decided that it would be in my best interest to take a mini vacation to visit her, as she just moved into her own apartment and could put me up for several days. However, I mostly biked where I needed to go, and without a car, I was unsure as to how I would get to Ohio. I lived in Chicago, and while Toledo was only 5 hours away, I knew that taking a train would be relatively expensive. One of my coworkers suggested I take a bus, and after a bit of research, I realized I could take a Greyhound bus for just under $60. Now, while I am a very independent and fierce woman, there was a little concern from my coworkers about an 18-year-old girl traveling on a bus alone. I laughed, as I can be very naive about such things, and just felt grateful that my coworkers liked me enough to be concerned about my welfare. So, fast forward to November, and I had my dad drop me off at the Greyhound station around 10 at night. I board without incident, and find an aisle seat next to a nondescript man who seemed content to stare out the window without so much as a word to me. While I can happily talk to anyone about anything, I was mostly hoping to catch some shut-eye, and had even burned several new CDs for my Walkman. Dating myself again, I know. The bus began its journey around 11, and I settled in, feeling very content, with plans to zone out and listen to the mixtapes I had made just for my ride. So, I guess all the trouble began shortly after making our first trip somewhere in Indiana. It isn't uncommon for people to make friends or interact amongst each other, and then to switch seats to be closer to their new buddies. Well, after our first stop, the girl who had been directly across the aisle had switched seats in order to be next to some guy she'd been chatting up. I was blissfully unaware of this transpiring, but was not very concerned when I looked up a short time later and saw a man sitting across from me. I continued doing my thing, but after maybe 30 minutes, I could feel this guy's eyes on me. It was dark on the bus, but I kept sneaking glances and realized after a few minutes that his gaze was unwavering. He caught me staring after a point, so at some point, he motioned for me to take my headphones off, and I did. Like I said, I grew up pretty confident in other people, and so there was never even a concern in my mind that this man could have any lecherous intentions. I assumed that he was probably just a guy who had hit hard times. By then, I had noticed that he smelled terrible, think BO, stale cigarettes, and the slightest hint of urine, and he looked pretty rough. He was likely in his mid-40s. There was an aisle between us though, so I figured chatting with him was harmless. I was bored and welcoming company by then. I have since forgotten his name, but our conversation started off innocently enough. Where are you going? Where are you from? Blah blah blah, the usual small talk. It became apparent though, that this guy was the type who just talks and talks about things I would rather die than to tell a stranger. You know the type. He's gonna visit family, but his church had to buy him a bus ticket because he hadn't worked in ages, he can't find a job, hasn't eaten in 3 days. Stuff that I wouldn't unload on some poor 18-year-old girl on an overnight Greyhound bus. Well, after some time, he kept harping the whole he is struggling bit and seemed to get resentful and sulky with me when I offered nothing but sincere apologies. I honestly did not have much cash on me, as I was only making minimum wage at the time, and while I sympathized with the guy, I needed every cent I had for the trip. At some point, the guy very pointedly told me that the reason he could not work was because he had AIDS. I empathized, as I do have several friends who are HIV positive, and I kinda figured that maybe the guy was gay. Regardless of whether or not we were family, I'm a lesbian. I was a bit put off by his pointed aggression when repeatedly telling me how poor he was. He kept suggesting that I had money I could give him, and I promised him I did not, in fact, have a surplus of cash. After becoming even more sulky and mentioning several more times that he hadn't worked, was hungry after not eating for 3 days, I sighed in frustration and handed him a bag of trail mix that I brought with me in order to avoid spending some money on food. I try to be super kind and empathetic to people, but by then I had had enough. It was close to 4 in the morning, and had not slept since the previous night, so I tried to be as cheerful and polite as possible when I told him that I was gonna try to take a nap. He seemed placated by my author of trail mix and smiled and told me to sleep well. After putting my headphones on, I kinda settled in with my eyes closed, but found myself unable to sleep. However, I was lulled into a very relaxed state and began to feel my nerves settling down, as this man's aggression had worked me up a bit. After about 15 minutes of peace, I began to feel that unmistakable feeling of being watched intently again. As it was dark, I kind of opened one eye a bit and snuck a sidelong glance at the guy across the aisle. Of course, he was staring at me, unwaveringly. I shut my eye and tried to remain as still as possible, so as to not give away any inkling that I was in fact still awake. All of a sudden, I felt a very long nail begin to slowly scratch my head. Mind you, I'm not talking like 15 seconds. This went on for anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, and I can firmly say 8 years later that it was probably the longest minutes of my life. Of course, by now, I'm having a full-blown panic attack, as I really hate people, family, friends, it doesn't matter, but especially strangers touching me. After it had stopped, I tried to keep my sleep charade going, even though I could feel my lungs wanting to expel ragged breaths. I sat there as still as possible, and once the CD had finished, I left my headphones on without starting the music again. I kept saying to myself in my head over and over, if I open my eyes and look at that guy's hands and those nails are long as heck, I'm gonna die. Like I mentioned before, the man had smelled like garbage, and thoughts of where those fingers had been or how long it had been since he washed his hands sent me into a mental frenzy. A short time later, I had the bus driver announce over the intercom that Toledo will be our next stop, and as the bus slowed down and pulled over at the terminal, the overhead lights came on. I took that opportunity to look over, and of course, all this man's nails were as long as claws. I jumped up and ran down the aisle and reached the doors before he even opened them. I still had to wait for the bus driver to get up and open the cargo hatch on the side of the bus. So I waited impatiently, hopping from foot to foot, desperate to get away. Just as the bus driver handed me my suitcase, the man emerged from the door of the bus and shouted loudly, "Hey, wait!" I should mention here that my friend who lived in Toledo worked at a 24-hour porn shop running the front counter, and since she worked the graveyard shift, which was unsurprisingly the busiest hour of operation, she was unable to pick me up from the station. I had MapQuested the distance from bus terminal to her shop before getting on the bus, and it was only about a mile away. I had planned on walking. Again, no money for a taxi. Also, I was naive and hadn't even thought twice about it. Thankfully, my creepy encounter ended the second my finger grabbed the plastic handle of my wheelie suitcase and I took off running into the night, and didn't stop until I was about a quarter of a mile away. So, word to the wise, if you ever find yourself traveling alone on a Greyhound bus and begin to smell the faint scent of stale cigarettes and pee, always check the culprit's fingernails. If they are long and dirty, sit as far away as possible.